Good afternoon. This is an experience report about Kanban at Vanguard. I'm Dave Hughes, the Senior Lean Agile Enterprise Coach at Vanguard's main campus located in Malvern, Pennsylvania. To be in the Vanguard is to be in the forefront. Vanguard began operations in 1975. Today, about $5.2 trillion in global assets are under management. Our core purpose was stated by our founder, John Bogle, to take a stand for all investors, to treat them fairly, and to give them the best possible chance of investment success. To fulfill that core mission, we believe that character counts: integrity, focus, stewardship, and our pledge to adapt, evolve, and continuously improve in pursuit of excellence. Vanguard remains alone in placing clients' interests in the driver's seat. Our corporate structure still is unique among mutual fund providers, with our shareholders as the ultimate owners, receiving the profits in the form of lower costs. Our average expense ratio is just 1/10 of 1%. If you'd like more information about Vanguard, please be sure to contact our public relations team at Vanguard Media Relations at Vanguard.com. To promote a lean culture at Vanguard and to enable the delivery of what we call business value at startup speed, we developed a lean operating model to illustrate our journey. One result has been behavioral change from the project team level all the way up to the business management level in order to align more closely with fast step value delivery. Another result is that the Scrum method has been associated with Vanguard's agile transformation by default. Well, the silver lining in this cloud is that the Kanban method is the disruptor, playing to its strength as the alternative approach to agility. Vanguard committed to an agile transformation in 2007. Agile and lean practices are encouraged within a federated structure across business units, and there are individual coaches operating within each of these federated areas. Business Value at Startup Speed was born in 2014. The program defines a solutions path for business problems using technology in creative ways. It promotes modern work practices, modern technologies, and modern infrastructure, enabling the three ways of DevOps: fast flow, fast feedback, and fast learning. From April 2018 through March 2019, maturity levels were studied to quantify the effects of 12 years of agile transformation and 5 recent years of DevOps activity. A target population of approximately 240 teams was identified, and then we sampled that, with the sample size growing to roughly 10% of the total population, with good distribution across the enterprise. In addition, an independent sampling dimension of approximately 700 individual practitioners was observed in training classes, coaching sessions, and on the job. The key result was that of the 24 teams in the sample set, all of which started with the Scrum method, 40% were voting with their feet and had switched or were planning to switch to Kanban. A related result was that the majority of the Kanban teams who recovered from what we call Scrum stall exhibited flow metrics which outperformed every one except one of the great Scrum teams. Vanguard is discovering that Kanban's alignment to the DevOps three ways is superior to Scrum's. One indicator is worth noting. In the past year, teams are asking for Kanban coaching in 4 out of 5 new requests. The reasons are obvious. First, for fast flow, Kanban has a richer, simpler, and more effective fast feedback mechanism as well, metrics and forecasting models. For fast feedback, Kanban's visual orientation encourages end-to-end thinking and a natural focus on the all-important upstream context. As you'll hear me say several times through this presentation, that focus upstream is the secret success sauce. And for fast learning, Vanguard knows it must continue to evolve its nimble digital infrastructure. Our CIO, named John Marcanti, puts it this way: we continue to learn more each day. My advice to everyone is to make sure you don't get too far ahead of yourself. Start at the foundation. Do you have a nimble enough infrastructure and software development practices and to evolve? Well, I don't know about you folks, but that sounds an awful lot like the evolutionary approach to Kanban. Vanguard tested its lean operating model for achieving business value at startup speed along 4 dimensions. First, if self-organizing teams are essential to enterprise agility, then what lean and agile method selection trends are observed over 12 years of transformation and 5 recent years of DevOps, and how do they focus on lean principles? Second, assuming that empiricism is essential to DevOps, fast flow, fast feedback, and fast learning, how are empirical measures used to promote continuous improvement in delivering value at a reasonable cost? Third, if the scientific method is applied, are repeatable experiments confirming expected results actually occurring? And fourth, what critical success factors appear to be common at Vanguard despite varying performance conditions? So the rest of this experience report is organized in 8 sections, and you can follow along our progress as the red indicator lights up. So let's pause for a second. I can put myself in your shoes out there. Okay, here's another gigantic slide deck full of scatter plots and cumulative flow diagrams where this guy carefully selected the very best teams to show how great Kanban is. I could repeat that message over and over to make you feel comfortable, but I won't do that. As Kanban professionals, we should be eating our own dog food. We should be applying systems thinking to test the validity of our assumptions. We should be applying the scientific method to find out how we actually reduce unevenness, overburdening, and waste. In short, my friends, we're looking to accelerate value, which is the delivery of fit for purpose at a reasonable cost. And we better be sure that we're delivering value. So my approach in this talk is as follows. Number one, first I will set the context and state the problem for which at least one hypothesis was formed. Second, I will share with you the before state involving agile teams. Third, I will reveal the critical success factors that evolved from each hypothesis, with an emphasis on how teams actually prove the results by repeating their experiments over and over again. And fourth, I will present empirical data indicating either increasing Kanban maturity or not. So at Vanguard, when we tested all of this, we wanted to know the effects of training and workshops, Kanban flight board levels, time-boxed iteration, and the famous new ways of thinking and working. So under controlled test conditions, we found that training classes and workshops delivered to full teams for Kanban practices and principles were inconclusive when tested against subsequent empirical performance for lead time and average delivery of work items. That hierarchical workflow boards stacked in flight levels or managed through time-boxed iterations were less effective for driving favorable outcomes for decision-making than classes of service on one big, well-constructed board. And that the so-called new ways of thinking and working, first pioneered by Microsoft Holland to foster radical decentralization, were sterile without lean or agile methods to actually deliver value early and often. So what really works at Vanguard are the following. Number one, deep coaching over a firm 90-day commitment window during which the teams and their management people can engage very deeply using practical systems thinking techniques. Here's a surprise: good old-fashioned systems analysis with a hearty focus on system context diagramming and workflow and service class visualization. Enterprise services planning, feedback opportunities as presented on page 24, figure 10 of Essential Kanban Condensed, with an immediate commitment to monthly operations review. A robust commitment to upstream filtering is necessary to eliminate unevenness as close to the source as possible. You'll hear me refer to this over and over again. This pays enormous dividends in the form of fast flow downstream under WIP limits. This is the secret success sauce, and I'll be presenting evidence coming up. So starting with this section, the rest of the 4 sections present exactly how Vanguard applied the scientific method in 4 logical performance perspectives. 1, teams that were Scrum and encountered Scrum stall and had to recover from it. 2, teams that saw Scrum stall coming and avoided it by switching to Kanban early. 3, teams that never experienced Scrum stall, but either were already doing Kanban or switched to Kanban from Scrum for other reasons. And 4th, static through a no-stall Scrum team, which is a very interesting perspective on our experiments. So let's talk a little bit about this Scrum stall thing. What is it? Well, stall is a metaphor. It's a sudden reduction in the lift generated by an airfoil, an air wing on an airplane, when the critical angle of attack is reached or exceeded. That critical angle of attack is about 15 degrees. And what happens is, as the air is flowing over the top of this airfoil, if you increase the airfoil's angle too high, you get turbulence, which creates unevenness and instability. It creates these little vacuums on the top of the airfoil. The result is that lift declines and drag increases. In other words, the airplane can't fly. Well, stall is a wonderful metaphor for unevenness and overburdening in the flow of knowledge work. The symptoms of reduced lift and increased drag are seen in scatterplot, high population means, and wide standard deviations among samples, as well as in cumulative flow diagrams depicting sluggish or average delivery rates with or without evidence of bottlenecks. If I were to use one word to kind of describe agile teams with stall symptoms, it would be mediocre. By the way, you're looking at a real team at Vanguard. Those metrics are real. So Scrum stall has 3 causes. First, myopia. This is a team-only orientation characterized by wearing blinders, sprinting heads down, with a limited awareness of upstream or downstream factors affecting end-to-end flow. The product owner bottleneck. Folks, Scrum has its strengths, but this isn't one of them. Too much power is invested in one individual. Too much power is required of one individual. Scrum's framework grew out of pure new product development practices, and the need for this kind of creative power can lead in far too many cases either to a single point of failure for the team or bottlenecked flow due to incompetence or a misfit between the person and the role. Where is encouraging acts of leadership at all levels in Scrum? We're having trouble finding it. The third item is what we call a hortator. This is the Latin name for a Roman galley gatekeeper who kept the rhythm of the oar drum by pounding on it. In Latin, this is a masculine noun. In English, we still have the verb to exhort and the adjective exhortatory or hortatory. Scrum sprints can be like ramming speed in the movie Ben-Hur. Instead of whip-limited cadences evolving naturally out of the team in an evolutionary way using Kanban, the Scrum cadence often is imposed from the outside without any respect for the team's natural tendencies. And therefore, this generates unevenness and overburdening. And of course, this leads to waste. So what are the effects of these three Scrum stall causes? Well, let's take a look at them. Number one, customers are trained toward low expectations. Delighting a customer with low expectations is an oxymoron. Number two, team mediocrity becomes ingrained. During the age of sail warships, penny-pinching captains used to train their gun crews through a thing called dumb show. That is, running the guns out, going through the whole motion of preparing to fire, but never pulling the lanyard or lighting the flintlock. So the teams looked great as long as the cannonballs never actually left the cannon. Unfortunately, this didn't turn out too well in actual combat conditions. The analogy with knowledge work is obvious. If you never fire the cannon to make a deliverable, you don't know what kind of fit-for-purpose value you are delivering at a reasonable cost. Mediocre system lead times and average rates of delivery play into the hands of traditional management, especially when high risk is involved. Perversely, mediocre Scrum teams experiencing stall justify the need for traditional project management tools, techniques, and processes. So let's start taking a look at how things really work out. And we'll begin our journey with a team P, as in Papa. This is a pre-Kanban state. And these folks were about 20 people, 2 managers and 2 team leaders. This team was a database-driven platform owners with a distribution of projects and the usual mix of recurring scheduled maintenance, break fixes, enhancements, and service and support. In their pre-Kanban state, their average delivery lead time was pretty high. Running Scrum, about 38 to 57 days. They had a low work item value elevated to production, and you can actually see it. This is where you fire the cannon. This is where you see the value being delivered. So upstream, they had quite a bit of unevenness. That led to overburdening, which led to technical debt, rework, and a lot of backward flow on their boards. The result was that they weren't even sure who their customer was. Since Scrum was unstable, they experienced Scrum stall and dropped out of the sky. So Vanguard has had great success with good old-fashioned systems analysis. The system context diagram is effective at casting upstream flow problems into sharp relief, while at the same time demanding a clearer depiction of exactly who the customers are. Said another way, the system context diagram helps eliminate variability as close to the source as possible. It also helps downstream flow by setting the stage for work item affinity analysis, which, if you group correctly, turns into classes of service. At Vanguard, we combine system context diagramming, system workflow visualizing, and class of service grouping immediately and all together. We emphasize simplicity and effectiveness all the time. So for stalled Scrum teams switching to Kanban, the payoff has been spectacular. Here's what simplicity looks like in practice for a system context diagram. What you're looking at took exactly 1 work session to generate. Here's what simplicity and effectiveness look like in practice for a system workflow visualization and classes of service modeling. This was done in 3 working sessions. And remember, Vanguard does this all together, not one step at a time. Here's what simplicity and effectiveness look like in practice for defining enterprise services planning cadences. This was done in 1 working session. By the way, note how existing meetings were repurposed. This is the lowest path to success. It's the lowest path of resistance. So Team P had a lot of manual processes, as I remarked to you, and there was a lot of push and unevenness and overburdening upstream from their standard flow. After our systems analysis sessions, they improve their upstream flow spectacularly. They increased their context understanding, they generated automation, and they improved their upstream flow. This helped them support capacity management much better downstream. So the bolded ESP cadences were the most significant contributors to improved speed and volume for workflow, operations review, and replenishment meeting. The stand-up, strategy review, and delivery planning and risk meetings evolved from existing meetings, so we repurposed those. The only ESP cadence not yet tried is service delivery review. However, its lack has had no apparent adverse effect. Systems thinking focused on everyone's attention on workflow visualization, as well as end-to-end optimization, has immediate work type affinity grouping that leads to strong classes of service. These in turn lead to stronger policies, reduced costs, and a far deeper understanding of exactly who the customer is. It's surprising how most teams really don't know who their customers are and who's receiving their products, their components, or their services. So at Vanguard, we have evolved Kanban practices at the team level by doing all of this simultaneously. Team P did a very nice job for their new classes of service, and this grew out of the system context diagramming, upstream optimization, and the fresh look at the customers that you saw mapped out by hand. Using the Jira platform, they automated their class of service metrics and simultaneously invested in evolving policies for managing value delivery this way. The cost of delay concept was new, so they struggled with that a little bit. But over time, they improved because as they saw improvements in WIP control, their classes of service generated better flow. Team P also put an emphasis on upstream filtering and classifying work items before they were pulled. They also focused very heavily on what we call right sizing, getting stories to the right size. So their work items came to have a very effective commit point. Explicit policy definition continued to improve, resulting in faster downstream flow. I think if you look at that, you'll see it's a rather classic workflow model, nicely balanced around the commit point. Now the fun point begins. System lead time improved an astonishing 78% in 90 days. If you take a look at that little highlighted spot over there at the far right, a little bit around 100 to 120 days, they had completely eliminated upper control limit violations. This is another characteristic experiment that we have repeated many times at Vanguard using our combinatorial approach. Now the question became, guys, that's great. Team P, congratulations. And it was actually in an operations review where I challenged the team to repeat their experiment. Now, if you can do it again 3 times, you really know how to do it. Well, there's the evidence right there. They did it the first time in August. In September, they had 10 days. In October, they hit 7.5 days. And in November, they hit 8.6 days. You'll notice that the standard deviations are not as low as we would like, but at an absolute level, their standard deviations used to be 20 to 30 days, wildly unpredictable. In short, Team P is now approaching predictability, and they therefore could define service level commitments. Guess what? Explicit policy evolution coming out of ESP made the difference. Now, system lead time improvement doesn't automatically guarantee cumulative flow or delivery rate improvement. This was a shock to most people at Vanguard. They thought, oh, you get improvement in both dimensions right away, and that isn't true. System lead time improvement has different causes than cumulative flow improvement. So let's take a look at this. At 3 months into their transformation, with system lead time burning it up, their flow metrics were struggling a little bit. You can see that great big orange bit. That's where more and more hidden work was becoming visualized. The evidence of flare, where the rate of identified work is beginning to get ahead of their rate of delivery, is obvious, and we talked about this in the operations review. As a matter of fact, we all agreed to focus on reducing that flare effect. So let's take a look 2 months later. Not bad. Things are getting a lot better. Bottlenecks are getting under control, but they're not completely solved. And you see that angle down at the bottom? Well, that's the elevation rate. That's the CI/CD production pipeline deployment using automated systems. Not great, but it was a lot better than the very flat, low cycle times they had before. So Vanguard implemented a page out of Goldrat's theory of constraints. They identified the bottlenecks and applied all 5 steps. I'll show you that bottleneck in a minute. But they also took another page out of Goldrat's theory. They construct simple, practical solutions, like using the system context diagram. So why were bottlenecks still in existence? Here's why. The root cause of the bottlenecks was traced to poor labor capacity distribution. The other good Kanban behaviors only went so far when bottlenecks were rooted in poor capacity distribution across the labor pool. Another way to say this is that tension introduced by WIP limits failed to achieve creative slack for Team P. The lack of slack was traced to 4 critical resources handling 60% of the work. All of a sudden, the light bulbs went off. The monthly operations review kept this important issue before the team and, more importantly, its management. So Team P also used this nice little chart about the Kanban principles and practices and how well they were doing. And unfortunately, they remained at maturity level 2 for managing flow and making policies explicit. However, there was another team called Team Q that learned from all of this experience, and they are represented here today. Team Q, I believe, will astonishing you. So let's take a look at them next. Team Q avoided Scrum stall because they could see it coming. Team Q has about 20 people or so, 1 manager and 2 team leaders. The team switched to Kanban from a 3-week sprint Scrum for 2 reasons. Number 1, uneven flow for work due to gravitational pull of a very large project. Number 2, there were too many flow boards stacked up in too many levels to address management oversight. So as you can see, this team does it all for revenue and rebate systems and services within finance. They deal with external vendors, projects, recurring maintenance, break fix, enhancement, service and support. This is a true full spectrum product support team. So Team Q avoided Scrum stall because they saw it coming. They truly were ready and able to shift. Originally, they felt that Scrum was beneficial for the large project work, and the majority of the team was committed to it. However, when the large project ended, the cost of uneven flow and multi-board overhead was pointless. So using sprints to limit WIP no longer had any value. The team needed to reorganize the way they worked to avoid the stall their team leaders could feel was about to happen. The leading symptom of impending stall was frustration with visualizing the end-to-end flow using the boards they had. A related symptom was hearing this refrain, "Sprints are pointless now." So the power of an end-to-end physical board with policies for workflow states, classes of service, and upstream filtering has been enormous and positive. This is a picture that shows Team Q's initial attempt to reinstitute physical boards, and it's correlated to a virtual Jira board. This is the fleshed out in-flight type board. And notice the integrating with external vendors. You can see Broadridge floating around up there in the upper left-hand corner. The emphasis here is on upstream filtering and flow control. It's very clear. Classes of service proved to be a major step forward. No expedites have occurred for this team in months. Let's look at the end of the board. Stop starting and start finishing is a thing that they use all the time. The team walks the board from from right to left. This was a new technique for them. The personal envelopes are evidence of successful completion, and it's a gratifying personal feedback loop, as well as being a tremendous, transparent radiator for all the teams where they work, as well as management. It is the synchronized physical board that has contributed most to this team's higher Kanban maturity levels. Inspect and adapt behavior is very strong for Team Q. Their retrospective habit is very strong. And here we have one of their brilliant insights. I've got to admit wow, I never would have thought of this, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time here. It's called the filter board. The threshold for the filter board is less than 1 hour of work effort. Circled items proved to exceed this threshold and were promoted to the Kanban system. X signifies actually done in 1 hour or less. So circled items are substantial enough to be promoted to the Kanban queue. Upstream filtering is critical to the success of this team. And they have proven this not only for themselves, but as other teams learn from them and adopt the same incredible practices. Remember, this team had this flight level thing going on, and they just basically gave up on it and moved to one large board and invested very heavily in classes of service. Paid a lot of dividends. Now, this is Team Q's flow metrics. I remarked before that cumulative flow and system lead time do not improve in lockstep. So in Team Q's case, there was a little bit of a lag, roughly 30 to 60 days behind their improvements in cumulative flow. But watch this. Prior, their average delivery lead times averaged somewhere around 20 to 45 days. They dropped 77% within 90 days. And take a look at the upper control limit violations 110 days out. 2 items. In short, ladies and gentlemen, this experiment was repeated from Team P to Team Q and several other teams in Vanguard, and they did exactly the same thing. I think we're on to something. Now here is the wonderful part about Team Q. Their improvement was spectacular. Prior to roughly January, as they were avoiding Scrum stall and switching over to Kanban fully, you could have labeled them a Kanban maturity model level 1 transitioning to 2 team. But in January, it took off. They are now a KMM level 3 team for a lot of reasons, and I'll share some of those common experiences before this talk is over. But let me talk to you about the things that made this possible for Team Q. We concluded that merging multiple separate boards into one large board promoted simplicity and effectiveness, and that enabled a robust focus on upstream work classification and filtering, which motivated the team to focus on WIP limits. Simultaneously, a set of service classes renewed the focus on who the customer is, as well as who the vendors are, and what the production release frequency could be. In retrospect, we discovered that Team Q's inflection point occurred when they achieved maturity level 3. We didn't know this in advance. So at Vanguard, we look back at where we can map to Kanban maturity model practices and techniques. We don't say, oh, let's do technique 1, 2, and 3 and then see if we get there. We have our own mix of what I'd like to call the fuel that launches the rocket. So at the end of the talk, I'll tell you exactly what those ingredients are. What I'd like to do now at this point is acknowledge the attendance of my crewmates from Vanguard. If you'd be kind enough to stand up, we have a group of people here from Vanguard. These are the folks I'm talking about. I'd like to thank you very much for making this talk possible. Without you, this wouldn't have worked. At that table back there is a guy named Joe and a lady named Mary Ann. This is Team Q's leaders. My friends and fellow KCPs, you need to go talk to them. They have figured out how to manage upstream flow, how to define classes of service, how to identify who their customers are, and you saw the improvement. Now, what were Team Q's critical success factors? There were 4 of them. Number 1, a big visible physical Kanban board. This provides power, folks. Kanban, Agile, Lean, they're all human endeavors and knowledge work. Why do we insist on looking them in a little screen? It's about that big. Do them both. Use the little screen stuff and the automated metrics to give you the fast feedback loops. In the meantime, do the human thing and get a great, big, beautiful physical board. Upstream filtering. This is the simplest board that could possibly work. Nothing fancy like Team Q's filter board. Focus on the bottlenecks. This means systems thinking and the theory of constraints. Team Q had one other item. They folded their external vendors into what they were doing. And number 4, the Kanban maturity model, along with implicit deep coaching and then reflecting good behavior back to the model, not using the model to explicitly drive it. What I'd like to do now is move on to the third part of our year-long experiments, which are looking at teams that never experience Scrum stall. So Team C is in the legal unit, and they are responsible for client operations, monitoring tools, communications and channels, compliance. They have a lot of small work items, a lot of enhancements and technical changes. They also have deadlines and dependency management at a higher degree than most other teams inside Vanguard. Team C is about 5 people at the core, and it expands and contracts depending on the kind of work they need to do at any one time. They've always used Kanban, but they did not always use class of service swim lanes. Team C forged a close working relationship with the Business Project Management Office, within which a dedicated team of upstream analysts focused diligently on work item affinity analysis and filtering. Team C therefore benefits tremendously from that upstream filtering that I talked about, which eliminates unevenness as close to the source as possible. Look at this cumulative flow diagram. If I was going to characterize that, it's steady as she goes. No bottlenecks. A nice, steady rise in delivery. And that purple piece, the one that constitutes the most, that's their elevation rate. Right there with the new work arriving. This, by the way, is another example of what Vanguard calls the secret success sauce. Folks, it's upstream. Now, Team C has a very interested limited WIP approach. They don't do explicit WIP limits. They have what they call implicit WIP limits through strong pull policies. Consequently, Team C exhibits some low maturity with respect to explicit WIP limits. However, the team has evolved its own unique yet implicit WIP limitation approach through strong pull policies. For system lead time, one would expect to see unevenness and high standard deviations, and we do. There's this sort of pulsing thing going on. You can see it every 4 to 6 weeks. Those are the bubbles that are seen to be drifting up from the bottom of the water. That happens to correspond to their elevation schedule. So they really haven't gotten ahead of this deliver early and often thing. They're still kind of lockstep on a 4 to 6 week cycle. Even so, further contributing factors may be that the operations review meetings no longer are held. They used to do them, and then they stopped. I'm trying to encourage them to go back. Now let's take a look at our next to last team. Team V as in Victor. Team V has 1 product owner, One Scrum Master and 11 development team members. They're a Scrum team originally, and for a Scrum team, this is 13 people, is a pretty big, expensive team. Team V claims that they did not experience Scrum stall, but they switched to Kanban because they spent too much time checking the boxes on the Scrum framework. They considered the Scrum framework basically overhead. Their Scrum velocity metrics revealed very little to them. They did them, but they really didn't pay attention to them. However, applying continuous flow metrics like system lead time and cumulative flow diagrams told a completely different story, and Scrum stall was the antagonist. When I shared this with them, two things happened. The whistling through the teeth as they sucked air and stood away, and the other was, don't show that to anybody, please. From the Scrum Master's point of view, the primary driver for switching from Scrum to Kanban was to raise the bar for sense and respond experiments directly with real customers. These guys are in the business of customer experience web interaction, so they actually communicate with customers in the field all the time. Cycle times needed to get much shorter, but without realizing it, they were laying the case to switch to Kanban. So Team V works in a Scrum lab area within Vanguard. Their metrics indicate that they're an example of how not to switch from Scrum to Kanban. Specifically, a mindset of 2-week sprints still can be observed in the system lead time metrics with a high unpredictability, even though they're still in that 10-day, 2-week band of work. This team's low maturity workflow state is still rooted in Scrum and not in their realistic workflow states. To give you an example of that, they did have some workflow states, design, analysis, test, and development. But instead of using those as a foundation for true workflow analysis, they converted them or tried to convert them to classes of service, which doesn't make much sense. So fortunately, the population mean of just under 5 days is good. Nevertheless, Team V is stuck in KMM level 1 practices with a low interest in evolving. Myopia and the product owner bottleneck are still here. Team V advertised what they called a 20 to 30% improvement in cumulative flow to their management when they switched from Scrum to Kanban. They did that in about 4 to 6 weeks. That was great. Kanban had a great moment there. And management goes, must be something to this Kanban thing if you guys could get that improved. And then they stopped. That was it. So the initial burning off, like setting fire to kindling, is now leveled off. And they still suffer from myopia and the product owner bottleneck. So again, they're stuck in KMM level 1 performance criteria. However, there are 2 bright spots. I don't want you to think that these guys aren't doing anything good. Bright spot number 1, they have a new focus on backlog replenishment and refinement. When they were operating under Scrum, they couldn't do it. They admitted they're just too busy checking the boxes on the Scrum framework, and the product owner made it up the day before the sprint. So now they're doing backlog refinement 2 to 3 days every week, which is good. The second good bright spot here is that they have evolved a risk review with a 90-day sliding window. That's very ESP-like. And when I shared that with them, they went, wow, what's ESP? I said, it's Enterprise Services Planning, and you're rediscovering it. It's that natural. How about we take the next step? It's okay, we got it. Can't convince everybody. You can lead a horse to water, etc. So folks, I wanted to share this with you because I promised you at the beginning, I'm not going to dazzle you with carefully selected teams. I want to reveal to you the systems thinking that went into the experiments at Vanguard. Last item. What about teams that never switched out of Scrum? But unbeknownst to them, they're actually using static to get the job done. So Team J is a data analytics and strategy team. This team was created from scratch just 10 weeks ago. They are a pure new product development team. Every member, the 6 people on this team, is cross-functional to a high degree. Everybody codes, nobody quits. Initially, they kept their options open as to which method they would adopt. Lean, Agile, Scrum, XP, Kanban, they weren't sure. So to keep their option open and their good humor, they named themselves the following way. We don't have a product owner. We have Madam Platform Owner, or MPO, affectionately. We have a Shusa, like Chief Engineer. We have a Zarina, who is not a timekeeper, not a Scrum Master, not a Kanban team lead, but the lady with the crown, who is ruthless about managing time and eliminating waste, hence Zarina. We respect her a great deal. And her face is turning red right now. We have Data Diva. We have Ultraviolet. The reason for the superhero Ultraviolet is his name is UV. And for me to remember it, you mean like UV is Y-U-V-I? And I said, oh, let's just call him Ultraviolet. That helped me a lot. Short attention span. And then yours truly, Sensei. So to cut to the chase, this team pivoted at 3 weeks and delivered a new product with new services, fully elevated to production in 4 weeks flat. Guess what the risk mitigation value quantification was on that? 90 million. This is what we call lean and agile behavior. So how are they doing it? Well, they're a Scrum team with a difference. They have a to-do board, the upstream filter to make sure work not related to the vision gets handled on a separate cadence. And as Zarina will tell you, you put something on that board, it is done in 1 day. And it is. We keep metrics on it. Our averages are like 1.4 days. Standard deviation is 0.6. That's pretty good performance, folks. They also have a Scrum board, but it's as simple as possible. Get the next one, no story pointing. They have a ferocious commitment to constant backlog refinement. They're ruthless about not wasting time, and they are massively committed to customer engagement. So let's take a look at their system lead time. That red line is just above 2 days. They deliver accepted quality a little bit over 2 days. They're on a 1-week Scrum sprint. It's fantastic. This is just 7 weeks of existence. Look at their standard deviation off to the right. Pretty cool. Take a look at their cumulative flow diagram. Team J has an aggressive focus on how work enters their system in the first place. In other words, they're learning from Vanguard's aggressive focus on upstream filtering. They have a superb product vision, which drives a ruthless commitment to discarding low-value ideas very early. They implement a simple to-do board I told you about, and they engage in continuous backlog refinement 2 to 3 times a week. As you can see, they have a beautiful cumulative flow diagram. Now, here's a secret. Team J is this close to continuous single-piece flow, and they're finding that out just now. Their embedded coach and database programmer has been quietly leading them in this direction. So it's only a matter of maybe 2 to 3 more weeks when we abandon Scrum altogether and go straight for continuous flow pull. How about that, kiddo? Thumbs up from Zarina. All right, we're now on the final part of the presentation. Thank you for your attention so far. We're going to take a look at ESP's positive impact on Kanban maturity levels at Vanguard. First, Vanguard has demonstrated that repurposing existing meetings to fit ESP is the path of least resistance to evolving lean maturity. The operations review makes all the difference. It is a huge step forward in transparency, collaboration, fast feedback, fast learning, and continuous improvement. Vanguard's experience indicates that the KMM has this a little bit out of sequence in terms of maturity levels. We believe that David Anderson's original take on the value of the operations review is more correct. So I quote from the Kanban Blue Book. The operations review also shows the staff what managers do and how management can add value in their lives. It also helps to train the workforce to think like managers and to understand when to make interventions and when to stand back and leave the team to self-organize and to resolve issues on its own. Operations review helps to develop respect between the individual knowledge workers and their managers and between different layers of management. Growing respect builds trust. It encourages collaboration and develops the social capital of the organization. Those are David Anderson's words, and Vanguard has learned that the best results come from investing heavily upstream to control work item flow into the system backlog and to attack variability as close to the source as possible. Here it is for the 5th time. This is the secret success sauce for everything. We have learned that physical boards invigorate daily Kanban stand-ups, and they also promote unprecedented levels of transparency within the team itself, among teams, and in any manager walking by to look at the big physical boards. Again, service delivery review is less important. Vanguard's experiments never established a need for it. So here we come down to the next to last section. Before presenting the conclusions for Kanban at Vanguard, let me spend a few moments exploring how we use the Kanban maturity model. We focus on managing flow and making policies explicit, and we integrate this with our experiments for promoting adoption of the DevOps 3 ways. The goal of managing flow is to achieve fast, smooth, and predictable creation of value and the delivery of customer value early and often. We want to minimize the cost of delay. So for Vanguard's lean operating model, we see complete alignment between this and the DevOps 3 ways. We have discovered through our experiments over the past year that the Kanban method provides more of what we need and want. KMM 3.7 in managing flow is particularly relevant. It says, actively close upstream requests that meet the abandonment criteria. Now, in a recent email thread on the KCP discussion group, Dave Anderson again had this great comment. I want to quote you again, David, if that's okay. He said, look, the way to get meaningful, accurate metrics is to make people use them, engage them in the discussion and the improvements. If Kanban meetings and operations reviews are about improvements and system-level discussions, and not just about heroics to ensure something is delivered on time, then you quickly find out that team members want accurate data. Inaccurate metrics come from the fact that other parts of the Kanban method are missing. If possible, think metrics are just for managers, then there is no incentive for them to help make them accurate. Well, at Vanguard, we do our best to make sure the incentive is there as simply and as effectively as possible. So for making policies explicit, this is the second part of the KMM we focus on. Our lean operating model experiments have observed a high degree of successful mapping to the following level 3 maturity items, and they are establishing initial request acceptance policies, pull criteria, delivery commitment point, customer acceptance risk criteria, and defining classes of service. It's the value orientation that drives everything we do, as well as driving our year-long experiments. So in conclusion, my approach in this experience report has reflected Vanguard's year-long study. We put it on a scientific basis, as you can see here. I presented what really worked at Vanguard. I haven't made any of this up. We've applied the scientific method, we've applied Kanban static, and we've applied enterprise services planning. And we've also mapped back to the Kanban maturity model. Perhaps in surprising ways, I'll grant you that, but we have evolved our own critical success factors, as listed here. You remember I told you about the 4 dimensions that we tried to prove? And we ended up validating lean and agile method selection trends, empirical measures, repeatable experiments, and common critical success factors. Well, here they are. Number 1, of the roughly 24 teams in the sample set, 40% are switching to Kanban. 4 out of 5 new requests are for Kanban. The switch to Kanban teams that used to be Scrum outperform all but the very best Scrum teams inside Vanguard. The JIRA control chart and cumulative flow diagram make all the difference. And it turns out that the Kanban maturity level 2 teams embrace those feedback loops. Taking a look at the empirical measures for value is very simple. Embrace those feedback loops, and we're in wonderful shape. The 3rd level was about the scientific method. And I walked you through recovering from stall, avoiding stall, never experiencing stall, and applying static even though you're a Scrum team. And 4th, what are the critical success factors? System context diagramming, upstream filtering, backlog refinement, affinity grouping, explicit policy definition, and preserving options to pivot. That is our success. And over all of it is encouraging acts of leadership at every level. So at Vanguard, our lean and agile teams experience the same resistance to change that others experience in large organizations controlled through traditional management methods. These models are characterized by incremental thinking, sclerotic budgeting processes, centralized decision-making, petty operating rules, and controllers who demand answers to the wrong questions. These models are not based on trust. They have a gravitational pull that's enormous. Now, your product, your planet, may be a little bit more dense than the planet Vanguard, but the principles I'm about to show you are the same. My final thoughts use a sort of rocket launch metaphor for Vanguard's approach to the Kanban method, and those 6 critical success factors have been evolved as the chemistry that we discovered over a year to do early, often, and all together. They are the ones that generate thrust. So for teams at KMM level 0, that kind of traces a ballistic trajectory. We get a little bit improved, but not very far. KMM levels 1 and 2 are kind of like that too. They get a little bit further. It's great initial development, but you don't get into orbit until KMM level 3 experience, and this is what we found. It's the trajectory that matters. It's the liftoff from that planet with the enormous gravity. So we don't agree with everything the way the Kanban maturity model is built. For example, we think that bottleneck should be a transitional practice into level 3. And we also think that the operations review also should be a transitions practice into level 3. That's how we use it. But these are minor points. The bigger picture is that Vanguard's lean operating model originally presumed that Scrum would be the critical success factor. It hasn't worked out that way. In fact, we're uncovering evidence that Scrum stall is a positive threat to that model. So the Kanban method maps more effectively to our desired outcomes for our lean operating model at Vanguard. This is our corporate mission, and our 17,600 crewmates are more and more inspired by the success of our Kanban teams. I've heard crewmates come up to the Kanban teams and say, "So how do you actually deliver so much value so well?" I think there's no greater compliment, especially when I hear that from managers. Thank you for your attention. Please contact me for more information or to discuss points of interest to you. Now enjoy the rest of this fantastic conference.